Anyone seeing the Facebook? You see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It is a delight and a pleasure to be here on this panel, an incredibly exciting panel this morning from LASA. This is the 2021 Howard F. Klein Award presentation panel. And it is my delight. My name is Ben Vinson. I was the chair of this year's committee, which also included Alberto Troncoso del Castillo from the Instituto Mora, as well as Vani Petina from Colmex. And I've got to say, this was a very, very difficult deliberation this year. We had some incredible submissions. And I've got to say, every year, people probably say this every year, but I've got to say this year was spectacular. It was an incredible outpouring of very rich work from our members, from the members of our grand intellectual community. As you know, the Howard F. Klein Award is given to the best prize in Mexican history annually by LASA in honor of the great historian Howard F. Klein. So this year, after considerable deliberation, multiple rounds, tussling, fighting, thinking, talking, we are pleased to award the award to two recipients. This year, it was neck and neck to the finish. And those two recipients are Ted Cohen for Finding Afro-Mexico and Pablo Yankelevich for Los Otros, Raza, Normas y Corrupción en la Gestión de la Extranjería en Mexico, from 1900 to 1950. Both books are foundational studies that move the field of Mexican history forward in incredibly impressive ways. Both of these books are incredibly well written, deeply researched, expertly argued, and they represent years of research and will definitely become classics for years to come. If you haven't gotten these books yet, don't waste any time now. Now, in particular, what struck the committee about Finding Afro-Mexico is its boldness, its wide range of source material, its willingness to take on hard topics that have been studied incompletely to date. This is a book that challenges some of the dominant conventional wisdom by arguing that modern 20th and 21st century Mexico's African presence, it wasn't hidden from view, as has often been alleged. Instead, Cohen shows that through the actions of cultural producers and policymakers and scholars, the country's Blackness and Black history, it became gradually revealed over time. His years of studying Afro-Mexico leads Cohen to what others haven't. By carefully analyzing how Black identity formation in Mexico worked in conjunction with internal politics, as well as international, transnational politics and processes, now he creates a telescope with a wide enough lens for us to fully see the historical phenomena. Cohen carefully appraises both the positive and negative influences that these forces have had upon resurrecting Mexican identity, and he produces a master work in the process. You're going to be hearing more about that as the day goes on. Equally important and angelically written, Los Otros is a dazzling study of rich and patient archival work. Pablo, I don't know how you did this. I mean, painstaking archival work involved in this. This is a book that arrestingly accentuates and offers primacy to migration and the rules surrounding the regulation of influxes of foreign populations into the evolution of the Mexican nation state. Now, in this sense, Yankelevich elevates an often obscured element to national history, combing through reams of archival evidence in a passionate and systematic way. Los Otros gives deeper meaning to the reality of contemporary Mexico and how we arrived there. Perhaps even more importantly, it insists that a fuller understanding of the evolution of Mexico necessitates understanding the consequences of populations born elsewhere and how their regulation helped forge what we recognize as the special polity and cultural landscape that modern Mexico is today. Exposing paradoxes, deep patterns of history, hidden truths, Los Otros is a masterpiece, written by an expert practitioner. This is the citation from us. You can see our reverence for both of these books. Today, we're going to hear from each of these authors, and we're going to hear from distinguished panelists who I'm going to introduce in short order. Our first book and first author to speak today, the format for today is to have the author say a few words, have the commentator say a few words, and then again, for our second book, the same process, and then we're going to open it up to see who wants to chime in, who has any thoughts, any questions, anything for our incredible authors. So I'm going to turn it over to Ted Cohen, but first let me introduce him. Ted Cohen is an intellectual and cultural historian of Mexico and the African diaspora. He has spent the last 7 years at Lindenwood University. He's joining Southern Illinois University at Carbondale as an associate professor of Africana Studies this fall. His book, of course, Finding Afro-Mexico, was published by Cambridge University, University Press, in the Afro-Latin America series. And of course, it is the honorable recipient, co-recipient this year of our book prize. Ted, over to you.
Well, first of all, let me thank LASA and the Howard F. Klein Prize Committee for this award, and to you, Ben, for organizing this session, and to Jolie for her comments soon. And thank you, everybody, for just coming and listening and taking time out of your day for another Zoom, Facebook, YouTube session. So I first began to think about Mexico's African heritage when I read Jose Vasconcelos's La Raza Cósmica. And like many academics and students in the US, and I think in Mexico, his ideas of mestizaje caught my attention and made me curious about Mexican racial formations. And I asked myself pretty early on, did he represent post-revolutionary Mexico's place in the African diaspora? And in my book, Finding Afro-Mexico, I say yes, and I say no. And more importantly, I believe that we need to stop focusing so much just on Vasconcelos as a representative of Afro-Mexican identity, especially since there are so many other Mexican intellectuals and artists who contributed to recovering the nation's African heritage. So in 2005, I began the research that became this book. And initially, I wanted to complete a social history of the African-descended peoples in the state of Veracruz, and especially in the city of Veracruz, where I could link Mexican history to the Caribbean and what I thought would be most easily to the African diaspora. And so I went excitedly to the archives to find archival folders dedicated to communities that identified as being of African descent. And as probably many of you could already guess, I was not terribly successful with this. And this left me in a tough position. I did not really want to try to identify who was of African descent in Mexico. If I did this, then I might impose my own definitions of Blackness onto Mexico, a methodology that risked being imperialistic and unaware of Mexico's own racial formations. And as a white man and a US citizen, I really wanted to prevent anything that would resemble this imperial gaze. Alternatively, I could discuss how Blackness disappeared, how it left the nation's social and cultural landscape. And this was the dominant narrative in 2005, and really it's still the dominant narrative with us today. Yet I was also uncomfortable with this theme. Black disappearance, I felt, assumed some true sense of Black identity or African identity that existed and then disappeared. It was too easy to take this idea and declare that people of African descent in Mexico didn't know who they were in the past, and they didn't know who they truly were now. And this idea of racial disappearance seemed to question, if not reject, the theories that we now accept about identity, theories that envision identity as fluid, multiple, and constructed. And so I changed my approach, and it led me to new sources and a new argument and a new method. And I didn't want to ask a negative question, like something along the lines of why and how did Black communities disappear? And so instead I asked, how did Mexican intellectuals define Blackness in Mexico? Something that was more about what was being said, not what was not being articulated. And by investigating this question, I could talk about disappearance, but I didn't have to define Afro-Mexican identity explicitly or implicitly in relation to a true identity that could disappear singularly and wholly. Finding Afro-Mexico first discusses how, before the Mexican Revolution, most liberals and conservative intellectuals and state officials wanted African-descended peoples and cultures to disappear and become part of a homogeneous, modern, mestizo nation. This pre-revolutionary idea that Blackness had disappeared or that it would soon disappear didn't really give post-revolutionary officials and artists and academics with a foundation to describe Blackness as Mexican. And this leaves us with a really important point, at least in my mind. No one had to talk about Mexico's African heritage after the Mexican Revolution, but some people chose to talk about it and to integrate it into the national identity. Today, activists and academics interested in the diaspora often criticize Jose Vasconcelos for his racist depictions of Mexico's African heritage. We should do this, certainly. Yet we must keep in mind that very few people in Mexico talked about African-descended Mexicans in the 20th century. We need to recognize that Vasconcelos and others like him made this choice to talk about Mexico's African heritage and to tie it in some fashion to Mexican mestizaje, even if they did it in a way that we might today in 2021 consider it to be racist. So in finding Afro-Mexico, I argue that beginning in the 1920s, musicians, anthropologists, and artists traveled across the country to study local communities and popular cultural expressions to forge the nation, just as Manuel Gamio wanted them to do when he wrote Forjando Patria. In some regions, they determined that there were African-descended cultural expressions. Perhaps the most famous is La Bamba in the state of Veracruz. Composer Jerónimo Baquero Foster acknowledged that La Bamba and other musical songs and genres affiliated with it had an African heritage in the 1930s. And so accordingly, I argue that we need to think about Black visibility and invisibility in more nuanced ways that change across time and space. And I argue that we need to think about and divide racial visibility and invisibility into their cultural, spatial, social, and demographic dimensions. And the same is true for racial disappearance. So in finding Afro-Mexico, I begin with the idea that any recognition of Blackness as Mexican in the 20th century was a radical act that expanded the boundaries of Mexican mestizaje in the cultural landscape that went with it. In the decades after the revolution, Blackness was generally visible in regional cultural expressions like La Bamba, and often in local histories told by Marxist intellectuals looking to uncover resistance and rebellion, especially in the colonial period, but all the way up to the Mexican Revolution. Gradually, in the second half of the 20th century, anthropologists like Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran and artists like Miguel Covarrubias began to trace the history of slavery and connect it to these regional cultural expressions. And they then concluded that people in regions with a history of the enslavement of African peoples and with African-descended cultural expressions probably had some African ancestry in those regions as well. And this ethnographic and cultural and artistic process helped Blackness become visible in society. So visible that it started in the beginning of the 21st century to be counted demographically on the census, just as the federal government did on an intercensal survey in 2015, and then on a national census in 2020, when more than 2.5 million people identified as being Black, Afro-Mestizo, or African descended. So to conclude, this history that I reveal in Finding Afro-Mexico helps us understand how Mexico got to this moment in 2020. So again, thank you all. Thank you for attending. Thank you to the committee for this honor. It's been a pleasure.
Ted, thank you. I think our audience gets a taste of the riches and pearls within your book. Those will be elucidated by someone who is familiar to all of us, and that is Professor Jocelyn Alcott, Professor of History International Comparative Studies, Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. Many of you will be familiar with her first book, Revolutionary Women in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, which explores questions of gender and citizenship in the 1930s, and her book, International Women's Year, the greatest consciousness-raising event in history, considers the history and legacies of the United Nations First World Conference on Women in 1975 in Mexico City. That book was with Oxford in 2017. Her current project is a biography of the activist and folk singer Concha Michel, a one-time communist who became an icon of maternalist feminism and a vocal advocate for recognizing the economic importance of subsistence labors, and this is under contract with Duke University Press. Let me hand it over to Jolly. Jolly? Oh, and yes, you are on mute.
Sorry, this is like a rookie Zoom error. Sorry about that. So it's a complete delight to have the opportunity to speak briefly about the conclusions of Ted Cohen's excellent book, Finding Afro-Mexico, which certainly fits the prize description of an outstanding book of major importance to the development of the field of Mexican history. In this deeply and meticulously researched account, Cohen guides us through both the historical and historiographical misperceptions that shaped our understanding of modern history, giving particular attention, as I think you just heard, to the visibility of that history. Carefully traces the cultural, political, and intellectual factors that inform the visibility of Afro-descended Mexicans through their social and cultural contributions. So Finding Afro-Mexico not only begins to fill a massive lacuna identified by Ben Vincent, among many others, regarding how little we know about Afro-Mexican history after independence, it also demonstrates the ways that Afro-Mexicanidad as a constellation of cultures and identities has in the modern period been simultaneously transnational and deeply Mexican. Opens his book with the 2015 INEGI Intercensal Survey, the first in modern Mexico to count Afro-descended population. For Anglophone readers in particular, much like the Memín Pinguín controversy of the early 2000s, the debates over the INEGI survey drops us straight into the deep end of debates about what it means for population to count and be counted. Do we do this to rectify social injustices, to acknowledge cultural influences, to for the historical record, or just sort of get the stats right or whatever? But by opening with the INEGI survey, Cohen also shows the ways that of Afro-Mexican visibility has, for various reasons, dominated our prevailing understanding of Mexican history. Indeed, when we discussed Ted's book in my graduate seminar, and he was generous enough to come for the last part of the seminar and meet with my students, and which they completely adored. It is for anyone interested, a very, very teachable book, and happily is now coming out on paper, so teachable and affordable. But the book that I had two students in the seminar who grew up in Mexico and went to school in Mexico and were shocked at how completely unfamiliar they were with this story that Ted tells here. So that to me, I think you begin to see already this is going to change the way we understand a really fundamental aspect of Mexican history. What provides here is not, as he mentioned earlier, a social of Afro-Mexico, which I think remains a bit elusive, but hopefully some enterprising grad students are going to get on that soon, but rather an intellectual and cultural history of that narrative of invisibility, offering, as he puts it, an alternative history and politics of racial formation and diasporic consciousness raising. I love a good consciousness raising, so he traces the ways that Blackness emerges into and received from view over the decades following the revolution as artists and intellectuals and activists fashioned a particularly Mexican understanding of race and racial difference, opening up the question of post-revolutionary Mexico's purported commitment to racelessness and assimilation. As he explains in his introduction, and I know you heard some of this just now, with the discussion of Blackness reduced to the dichotomy between colonial visibility and post-colonial invisibility, mestizaje becomes nothing more than a euphemism for Black disappearance. The possibility that it could also nourish democratic theories of nation-state formation built on popular suffrage, social justice, ethnicity and cultural pluralism vanishes in that formulation. In other words, and I think we heard a bit of this just now, we don't have to redeem Jose Vasconcelos to be able to recognize the radically democratic possibilities of mestizaje. Importantly, Cohen demonstrates the ways the Mexican understandings of Blackness developed amid a transnational exchange, particularly with US and Caribbean artists and intellectuals, and reflected the articulation with changing understandings of indigeneity within Mexico. Prominent African Americans such as Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, W.B. Du Bois, Katherine Dunham, and Jack Johnson were drawn to Mexico as a reprieve from Jim Crow in the United States. But prominent Mexicans such as Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran and Miguel Covarrubias also traveled to the US and particularly to draw inspiration from the rich cultural and intellectual milieu of the Harlem Renaissance. And I would say the Harlem Renaissance proper and the legacies there of the mid-20th century. We particularly see the ways that this robust cultural exchange often served as a glue for the transnational left, as struggles racism and white supremacy were braided with struggles against the global rise of fascism and the predations of international capitalism. As Cohen explains, and I'm forgive me for what is a somewhat long here, but his discussion about music and jazz in this book is truly wonderful. If you read it for nothing else, you should read it for this theme that runs through. Beautifully rendered. So Cohen explains, in the 19th, jazz flourished as the that connected Mexican, African-American, and Afro-Cuban music. As a symbol of all oppressed peoples, this musical genre introduced the transnational potentiality of Blackness to Mexico's musical canon and the cultural worldview of the Mexican left. No longer a threat to indigenous music or Mexican identity, Black melodies, harmonies, and rhythms from across the Americas the radical spirit that animated the nation's new historical pantheon, New World modernism, and global anti-fascism. As Mexican writers, artists, and traveled to New York City and Spain, they began to envision the shared structural, historical, and cultural experiences of African-descended peoples in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, they constructed, I love this, they constructed a revolutionary community that made the Black radical tradition, chiefly new Cuban artistic expressions, compatible with the post-revolutionary nation-state formation. This is like smack in the middle of the book, but I think you get a taste there of how Ted really this cross-fertilization and the way it was fostering an entirely new political way of thinking that I think has not been part of our understanding, at least not part of my understanding, post-revolutionary state formation before now. Cohen adopts a quasi-prosopographical approach following figures such as Covarrubias, Aguirre Beltran, and Chavez as they doggedly sought to construct ethnographic, ethno-historical, and ethnomusicological music of Mexico's African roots. Cohen shows us, for example, how Covarrubias' 46 ethnography, Mexico South, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, emerging from Covarrubias' anti-fascist convictions and translated in part by his dear friend Langston Hughes, attends as much to the influences of African cultural traditions as to indigeneity, for which it's, I think, better known. Aguirre Beltran, whose particular into the intersection of ethnography and demography had already drafted his Población Negra de Mexico when he was drawn into the orbit of Melville Herskovits, a padrino of African Americans in the United States. This orbit included not only intellectuals such as W.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson, but also ethnographically sophisticated creatives such as the choreographer Katherine Dunham and the writer Kirsten. When Aguirre Beltran returned to Mexico to publish history, although not with Fondo de Cultura, which was then under the founding editor Jose Villegas, it bore the imprint of all of these exchanges, but making it not US oriented or US inflected, but rather consciously Mexican. Hoping to avoid the United States' racial logic, Aguirre Beltran advocated for a more inclusive concept of mestizaje that explicitly honored its African influences. I want to conclude with a little risk of indulgence in here, because I have to say that Cohen's book kind of upended my regarding my somewhat beleaguered project on the activist and folk Miguel. Miguel developed her career as a semi-trained ethnomusicologist during this period, working with prominent scholars such as Vicente Mendoza, And she ran in these same circles of the cultural left that Cohen discusses here. That is to say, just thinking about my own little research project, I can see how finding Afro-Mexico demands that we reconsider the social, cultural, and political dynamics at play in post-revolutionary Mexico. Before reading this book, I have to admit, I never once thought of Concha Michel's story with a history of ideas about Mexican Blackness. But Ted Cohen's book demonstrates how much I've been missing in that blind spot. So congratulations once again, Ted, on this prize.
Thank you, Professor Alcott. Thank you very much. And you used the word taste several times. It must be getting close to lunchtime. So our next co-recipient is none other than Pablo Yankelevich. He is a professor researcher at the Centro de Estudios Históricos of the Colegio de México, and he's currently the director of the Centro de Estudios Históricos. He holds a PhD in Latin American Studies from UNAM and specializes in 20th century Latin American history. He is a member of the Mexican Academy of History and the Mexican Academy of Sciences. He is director of the book series Historias Mínimas, published by El Colegio de México. Professor Yankelevich performs research in Mexican contemporary history, history of Latin American exiles and political refugees, history of migration in Mexico. And he currently is developing a project focused on social exclusion, discrimination, and racism in post-revolutionary Mexico. Let me just take a pause here. He is the author of more than 100 journal articles and book chapters. Let me just salute, salute appropriately Professor Yankelevich for that incredible feat, and is the author as well, or co-author of more than 20 books. His most recent book is, of course, Los Otros, Raza, Control, Corrupción y la Gestión de la Extranjería en México. Pablo.
Thank you very much. I will speak in Spanish. Bueno, ante todo, yo quiero, quiero agradecer a LASA, al jurado por este premio, que además para mí es un honor compartirlo con Theodore Cohen, porque Finding Afro-Mexico, además de ser un excelente libro, con Theodore no solo comparto el premio, sino también comparto los temas y las preocupaciones, porque el libro de Theodore de alguna manera es un excelente antecedente a lo que yo trabajo en mi libro, así que esto ha sido una coincidencia estupenda. Quiero agradecer a Ben la organización de esta mesa y de manera muy especial quiero agradecer a Kif el haber aceptado, Kif es una colega y una amiga muy querida, el haber aceptado estar en esta presentación. Y también quiero decir de que para mí es un gran honor recibir este premio por otra razón. Esta es la primera vez que se otorga el Howard Klein a un libro escrito en español. Y esto para mí es un motivo de orgullo, si se quiere, es un motivo de orgullo lingüístico y una reivindicación del idioma con el que hablamos, investigamos y escribimos los que vivimos al sur del Río Bravo. Bien, el libro Los Otros parte de una premisa muy sencilla, muy sencilla, que es indagar, estudiar las maneras como se piensa y se gestiona las políticas de extranjería y sobre esta base tratar de entender y de ampliar el conocimiento sobre los procesos de construcción nacional en las naciones modernas y, por supuesto, en sus respectivos estados. La idea es que autorizar o prohibir el ingreso de extranjeros a un territorio nacional, así como otorgar o no otorgar cartas de naturalización, definen, ensanchan o restringen las dimensiones de las comunidades políticas y fijan fronteras culturales y políticas entre nosotros, los que vivimos dentro de las fronteras, y los otros, los que llegan. Pero lo digo esto porque México constituye un caso muy paradójico. Y esto es lo que a mí me ha llamado la atención. Se trata de una nación en la que fracasaron todos los intentos por promover políticas de inmigración a gran escala. México nunca recibió corrientes masivas de inmigrantes. Sin embargo, desde las primeras décadas del siglo pasado, México instituyó las políticas de migración y de naturalización de extranjeros más restrictivas de América. La pregunta es muy sencilla. En México, hasta la fecha, acaban de salir los resultados del censo 2021, los extranjeros en el total de la población arrojan una cifra marginal. Los extranjeros representan menos del 1% de la población en México. Sin embargo, México tiene una política migratoria altamente restrictiva. Es decir, ¿cuál es el sentido de una política restrictiva en un país en donde los extranjeros no llegan a vivir? ¿Para qué se ponen esas políticas? Y la segunda pregunta es un poco todavía más incómoda y tiene que ver mucho con el libro de Theodore. Es cómo un país que se convierte en, de alguna manera, vanguardia de las posiciones antirracistas desde muy temprano en el siglo XX, pero sobre todo con posiciones muy de vanguardia en el marco de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, en ese mismo momento instituye políticas migratorias altamente racistas. ¿Sí? Es decir, el antropólogo que estudia Theodore, que refiere Theodore, Aguirre Beltrán, es funcionario de un gobierno que tiene prohibido el ingreso de afros a México. Los afros no pueden ingresar a México hasta 1951. Entonces, en este libro se estudian estas particularidades y la investigación se desenvuelve o tiene lugar en un momento muy particular de la historia de México, porque el país sale de una revolución que promete una completa refundación del orden económico, político y social, y en ese mismo momento están llegando a México unos pocos migrantes de orígenes extraños, son migrantes de Europa Oriental o de Medio Oriente, también en un contexto en donde México tiene fuertes tensiones con los Estados Unidos porque Estados Unidos está deportando trabajadores mexicanos a México. Entonces, en los años 20 y 30 comienzan a dibujarse un nuevo paradigma de migración y de demografía en México que va a contrastar muchísimo con lo que sucede en el siglo XIX. Y en ese contexto se debaten y se aprueban reformas legales, reformas constitucionales, leyes migratorias, y sobre todo se crea la agencia encargada de la inmigración en México. Entonces, lo que este libro propone es una reconstrucción de la historia, de la política migratoria y de la política de naturalización durante la primera mitad del siglo XX, y el punto de partida de este libro es explicar los imaginarios históricos y culturales desde donde se pensó a los extranjeros en México. Luego se estudia las normas, la legislación, los espacios de la administración pública y luego se explora la intervención de expertos, entre otros, por ejemplo, Aguirre Beltrán, Manuel Gamio, fueron funcionarios de la migración en México, del Departamento de Migración. Funcionarios y en algunos casos directores. Y una parte medular del libro, el corazón del libro, es un trabajo que tiene que ver con tratar de responder una pregunta, que es, ¿por qué en México las leyes no se aplican? ¿Por qué se aplican tan poco las leyes? ¿Por qué la ley dice una cosa y en la realidad pasa otra cosa? Y la respuesta está en la corrupción, en las prácticas de corrupción, ¿sí? Y la segunda parte del libro tiene que ver con, básicamente, políticas de naturalización. Son muchísimos menos los extranjeros que se alcanzan a naturalizar. Son tan pocos que hasta los pudimos contar uno por uno. Pudimos contar la serie completa de extranjeros naturalizados a lo largo de 125 años. Y también explorar de nuevo los espacios de corrupción, arbitrariedad. Entonces, yo digo que una de las cosas que más me entusiasmó de esta investigación es la posibilidad de haber accedido a fondos documentales que estaban escondidos, que estaban cerrados y que están de nuevo cerrados ahora, desde el año 2017. Y pudimos durante muchos años ir entrando a un archivo que no estaba abierto y tampoco estaba organizado. Fue un trabajo durante muchísimos años de ir sacando material de un fondo que tiene más de 4 millones de papeles. Para concluir, yo diría de que, como decía Ben al principio, este libro en realidad está mirando al presente, está mirando los problemas de la agenda gubernamental de México, los asuntos, los orígenes de los problemas de la migración irregular hacia Estados Unidos, la ausencia de control al ingreso y la permanencia de extranjeros, es lo que estamos viendo en Frontera Sur hoy, la complicada burocracia de trámites en la naturalización y en la migración, la corrupción y la arbitrariedad, el racismo y la discriminación todavía en políticas migratorias, son temas que de alguna manera han estado ausentes de la investigación histórica en México y que de alguna manera estamos haciendo visibles con los materiales de esta investigación. De eso básicamente se trata el libro. Muchísimas gracias de nuevo a todos.
Pablo. Well, thank you so much for enriching us deeply with the book project and letting us know its scope and impact. Here to comment today, as you signaled, is, of course, Kif Augustine Adams, who is the Ivan Mitas, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the Ivan Mitas Chair and Professor of Law at BYU Law School. Professor Augustine Adams joined the J. Reuben Clark Law School in 1995. And with Associate Dean Carolina Nunez, she created the Refugee and Immigration Initiative, a course that takes law students to the border to provide frontline legal triage to asylum-seeking women and children who are detained in immigration centers. Now, her regular teaching assignments include torts, seminars in feminist legal theory and critical race theory, as well as professional responsibility. And her scholarship focuses on intersections among citizenship, immigration, gender, and race throughout the Americas. Prior to joining the BYU law faculty, Professor Augustine Adams practiced administrative law with Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. Professor Augustine.
Bueno, agradezco a todos que puedo estar aquí, especialmente a Pablo, tanto por escribir este libro, que por invitarme a acompañarle en reconocer este gran honor de recibir este premio. Yo conocí a Pablo hace muchos años en Ámsterdam, creo que fue, sí, en una conferencia allí, y desde entonces ha sido un gran amigo, y sus estudios, sus investigaciones en cuanto a la inmigración me han inspirado mucho. In times of COVID-19, reading Pablo Yankelevich's beautifully detailed book, Los Otros, is déjà vu. As he wrote, Yankelevich likely intended the more modest task of historical analysis than the dark prophecy the book portends. Its central concerns, all based on research in an earlier era, forewarn of contemporary tensions around race, migration, discrimination, public administration, law, corruption, and the construction of the nation state. Even before COVID-19 manifested its grim form, Yankelevich's analysis of those tensions along dos matrices, una de inclusión y orgulloso reconocimiento, la otra de exclusión y generación de alteridad, captures the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and indeed this whole last year, just as succinctly as they do the first half of the 20th century. Nationalism, xenophobia, racism, both in Mexico and across the globe, are still agonizingly present. From 1900 to 1950, as now, the United States repeatedly pressured Mexico to do the dirty work of racial exclusion along our shared border. Yankelevich characterizes that historical pressure as constante para que México cooperara para frenar el ingreso de asiáticos first, and later other groups. In the 21st century, the US government directs a similar constant pressure at Mexico to stop the flow of migrants at both its northern border with the United States and its southern border with Guatemala. Within the 50 years of Yankelevich's study, Mexico reciprocated the United States' evil of racial and ethnic discrimination at the border by excluding African Americans from entry into Mexican territory, a lesser known aspect of well-documented migration tensions between the two countries. While the book's title limits Yankelevich's purview to Mexico, the truth of the themes he identifies encompass the United States and shared borderlands as well. Beyond the structural themes and analysis so relevant to our own time, Yankelevich's research reveals a series of early 20th century circulars, many heretofore confidential or secret, that governed migration in Mexico, using the term governed quite loosely and somewhat ironically. The circulars were órdenes administrativas unas veces y políticas otras, algunas públicas y otras confidenciales, instrumentos que sirvieron para instaurar prácticas de exclusión de inmigrantes, contraviniendo en muchos casos a la legislación vigente. Yankelevich demonstrates that by 1935, more than 400 printed circulars and 700 unprinted circulars, along with other written instructions, tyrannized migration in Mexico. A commentator at the time called Mexico's migration system un caos completo. From the perspective of legal philosophy, Yankelevich is spot on when he notes that the consequences of the circulars were to abrir las puertas hacia una incontrolable arbitrariedad. Arbitrary norms foment chaos and corruption, another theme of Yankelevich's work. Secret circulars that outline prejudices and limitations on immigration appear to follow forms of law and directives from an appropriate government agency, but actually undermine law through their secrecy. How can a system of law exist when the rules are secret, constantly changing, and subject to the whims of the government agents applying them? That at least some of the circulars and many of the quotidian administrative practices at ports of entry contravened extant legislation highlights how much power Mexico's already singular executive accrued at the expense of the legislative and judicial branches in the area of migration. Chaos and corruption redirected power. Although Mexico appealed to modernity in its structures of government and its use of data and statistics, Yankelevich's research makes clear over and over the failures of law and the potency of personal privilege within Mexico's administrative state, even after the 1910 revolution and the aspirational reforms of the 1917 Constitution. Andres Landa y Piña presents as a central figure in that chaos and corruption that characterized Mexican immigration in the first half of the 21st century. Fully committed to modern methods of government through data gathering and statistics, but not to human resource management. Landa and Piña was unable to exert sufficient discipline either on himself or within the administrative agencies he led to ferret out exploitation and ineptitude. His repeated inability to effectively discipline subordinates, like Rosendo Herrera, whose spectacular malfeasance included false imprisonment, extortion, bribery, threats, and likely violence, may simply represent acquiescence to political reality. It could also be evidence of Landa y Piña's own corruption. Disciplining less egregious behavior by border agents may likewise have been unpalatable to Landa y Piña for other reasons. Severe lack of resources constrained the low-level border agents' jobs in ways that made suborning bribes and extra fees a means to economic survival. In the chapter, Negocios de la Migración, and after, Yankelevich relates story after story that each drives home the nauseating structure of a migration system built on personal appeal and exploitation. In the 1930s, Jacobo Hassan Cohen successfully purchased a visa for his 76-year-old father to enter Mexico from Syria. Israel Tannenbaum, a young Polish Jew, could not. In the 1940s, Marie Schwartz paid una enorme mordida and relied on Andres Landa y Piña's personal intervention for Mexico to allow 5 young men from Schwartz's extended family to enter Mexico and escape Nazi murder in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. At least 27 other members of their family perished in Nazi concentration camps. Kainosin Osawa, a doctor of Japanese extraction, relied on his relationship with President Plutarco Elias Calles and the president's direct intervention in 1928 to force the government to grant his naturalization petition. Corruption and personal connections bought life for a few. Yankelevich provides a brutally honest portrayal of discrimination, xenophobia, and corruption in Los Otros. Mexico, however, holds no monopoly on these stories, past or present. As part of its ostensible COVID-19 strategy, the United States closed its borders with Mexico and Canada, even to asylum seekers. It now summarily deports individuals who enter the country without inspection, despite international law, and without even the barest pretense of legal process its previous policies begrudged. People have died. People will die. The answer in the United States, in Europe, in Mexico, everywhere, is not the sorts of corruption and personal connections that Yankelevich identified as arbitrarily buying life for a privileged few, but national migration systems that recognize humanity. Each country's own dolorosos recuerdos, as Ignacio Vallarta called Mexico's history, will delineate the context in which specific migration reforms play out. Understanding that past, as Yankelevich's book allows us to do for Mexico, can invigorate the matrix of inclusion y orgulloso reconocimiento. Let the past not be prologue, nor Yankelevich's tale prophetic.
Eloquent words. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our authors. Everyone should be getting a rich sense of the power of these books and the complementarity of their ability to penetrate this incredible period of Mexican history. We're going to proceed to a question and answer period. I'd like to actually begin with a question that's been on my mind. And so I'm going to ask it, and this is for Pablo. Pablo, one of the things I've been trying to understand is, and this is again, probably a narrow slice from some of my own areas of curiosity. You know, throughout the Mexican Revolution, there was in the African-American press here in the United States, a lot of articles were written about Mexico as a remarkable place to go. And so we do see African Americans leaving the United States and going to Mexico, starting in the 19th century, but really the Mexican Revolution became seen, and from an African-American perspective, as an opportunity. And then really in the 1930s and really in the 1940s, with the free fall of the Mexican peso and the rise of the Mexican tourist industry, and really World War II creating circumstances where Europe was not as inviting a place for travel, we see American tourists coming more and more into Mexico, and African Americans coming in too, and using sometimes their ability to come in for a short period of time for extended stays. And so I always wanted to understand, we see people, African Americans working in the Estudios Churubusco and movies and doing all kinds of things. And so I wanted to understand how your book helps us to maybe also understand some of these temporary moves to Mexico that become long-term moves, and how that fits into your study. I don't know, hopefully my question is clear, but I'm trying to understand the ability for Mexico to take in these African Americans through this period where the laws are more restrictive than when I learned in your book. I said, wow, what I saw is very different from the book, because Mexico was really trying to do other things with their policy, yet these people are coming. I don't know if there's more explanation there, given what you've seen. In Spanish, of course. Yeah.
Sí, no, bueno, es que lo que tú preguntas es parte del enorme problema, porque lo que vemos es la superposición de categorías raciales y laborales y nacionalidades. Te doy un ejemplo. Si tú eres afro de origen cubano, eres latinoamericano, de tal manera de que por esa vía podías negociar un ingreso. Pero si tú eres afro proveniente de Belice y quieres trabajar en la península de Yucatán, no hay posibilidades alguna. Ahora, si tú eres afro norteamericano y quieres y trabajas en los ferrocarriles, o trabajas en una banda de jazz en Tijuana, o trabajas cuidando caballos en el hipódromo de Tijuana, vas a conseguir una visa. Pero si eres un afro norteamericano de clase media que quiere venir a México de turismo, no vas a conseguir una visa. ¿Sí? Es decir, hay un grado de arbitrariedad enorme, enorme, pero no solo de arbitrariedad, sino de contradicción, porque a lo que voy es a lo siguiente. La investigación de Aguirre Beltrán sobre los negros en Ouija, el libro clásico de Aguirre Beltrán, escribió ese libro siendo funcionario. Él era jefe del Departamento de Demografía de la Secretaría de Gobernación. El Departamento de Demografía era parte del Departamento Migratorio, ¿sí? Y en los momentos en que él estaba escribiendo este libro y haciendo la investigación, los afros no podían ingresar a México. Entonces, ¿cómo puede convivir esta contradicción? Y convive, ¿sí? Porque lo que hay detrás es un enorme prejuicio, Y lo que está detrás es el problema del mestizaje planteado de una manera absolutamente barroca, como lo planteó Vasconcelos, ¿sí? Porque son solo dos afluentes, los españoles y los indígenas, pero estos afluentes no son iguales. Hay uno que es superior a otro, ¿sí? Eso lo dice claramente. El mestizo es superior al indígena, el blanco es superior al indígena, y el afro es un peligro porque es un peligro para el retroceso de la raza. El afro degrada el mestizaje, ¿sí? De tal manera de que está cerrada la puerta para los negros. Pueden entrar beisbolistas, artistas, deportistas, ¿sí? Pero es muy difícil que un turista afro pueda pasar en su auto. Muy difícil. ¿Sí? Ahora, si paga, va a pasar. Si paga, va a pasar. ¿Sí?
Thank you. That's very, very clarifying. I've been waiting a couple of months to ask you that, so thank you. I'm going to look to Vanessa or our friends from LASA. I don't see how to manage our list here in terms of guests, and so I will also see if any of our visitors, panelists, would like to ask a question as well of our two authors. But Vanessa, are you with us?
Yes, I am here, Mr. Ben. We have no questions in the Zoom, and I'll let you know in Facebook.
Thank you. In the meantime, I don't know if Jolly or Kif, if you have, are you inspired to ask any questions of our guests while Vanessa looks on Facebook?
I would actually love to hear Ted talk a bit about what Pablo's findings. This seems like it's a really interesting conversation, particularly given what Pablo just said, a really interesting conversation between these two books.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I think in a lot of ways, what Pablo said when he started talking initially about his book is I think there's this really great synchronicity between what he's doing and what I'm doing in our respective books, not just about the question of Afro-descended peoples in Mexico, but even just thinking about how we might think of national identity in Mexico, not from the local perspective like we've traditionally done for decades in Mexico, but what happens when we start thinking about it from Mexico's national vision or a global perspective in working our way inward. But I think in particular to what this discussion of how we think about immigration to Mexico of people of African descent and the different nationalities that they bring with them. The thing that comes to mind for me is that we have to not only break apart questions of the diaspora and nationality, like Pablo's already mentioned, but we also have to think about the different dimensions of racism and anti-racism. And so there might be within this confounding mixture of institutional bureaucratic thought, or even just within the mind of Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, these competing ideas that are intended to be forward-thinking and what we might call today anti-racist, and yet clearly aren't. And it's not, I think we too often get stuck in this moment of, is somebody racist or are they not racist, especially in the past, and especially for Mexico on questions of its African heritage. And what Pablo is really rightfully saying is that it's not that simple. It's not an either or, it's often a both. And I think that's really where the two of us are intersecting. And so you have someone like Aguirre Beltran, who in his work in Guerrero and Huila that Pablo alluded to. In my work, that comes out as both utterly cutting edge in introducing African descended peoples and communities to Mexico's contemporary moment in the 1940s and 50s. And in that way, it's completely what we would think of today as pluralist, multicultural, anti-racist, maybe the best possibility of what mestizaje could be. But at the same time, he's working off of Herscovitz's very contrived, stereotyped, racist ideas of what is African, in doing it in a way that we would today find very, very uncomfortable. And that our theoretical apparatus has completely transcended since the 40s and 50s. And so I think there's a really nice connection here between what I think in these two books about we need to nuance, all of these big terms that are bouncing around both in Mexican history, but also just in our contemporary moment right now.
Mhm.
Can I weigh in on a theme that I see between the two books as well, or at least the practice of getting to the books, especially because Pablo mentioned just now that the archives on which he relied were open for a while, at least to him, and are now closed again. And so I see in both of these books appearance and disappearance, openness and secrecy, hiding and revelation, and how that is a tool of power, that control of information and access to knowledge and to experience. And I don't know if Pablo and Theodore, you would each like to sort of comment on how you see that working across your two books. I mean, it's just so, are the archives closed now to hide that again, and to make it secret again, to bury the corruption?
You ask me, es una pregunta. Sí, sí. Bueno, no. No te olvides de que esto es lo más parecido a Macondo y a García Márquez. Ese archivo estaba en la bodega de un edificio que se había caído en el sismo de 1985. Estaba en condiciones desastrosas, con hongos, humedad. Bien. Entonces, ese archivo se rescató, ¿sí? Y se mudó a un nuevo edificio y se comenzó a ordenar. Pero cuando se comenzó a ordenar, ya aparecieron las Torres Gemelas y el ataque de Bin Laden. Ustedes dirán, bueno, ¿y qué tiene que ver una cosa con la otra? Tiene que ver con que decidieron de que esos documentos eran documentos de seguridad nacional. Entonces los cerraron. Luego los volvieron a abrir, ¿sí? Pero entonces luego vino el sismo de 2017 y el edificio donde estaba el archivo se cayó. Entonces sacaron los papeles de nuevo y se los llevaron a una bodega que está cerrada, porque no es un lugar para tener acceso a papeles, ¿sí? Entonces, tiene que ver con secrecía. Durante muchísimos años el gobierno del PRI prohibió el acceso a esos documentos. No había archivos. Aparecieron, se empezaron a ordenar y luego sucedieron una cantidad de cosas que impiden hoy volver a ingresar a esos papeles. Son papeles históricos, son papeles del año 1920, 1930, 1940, no son papeles actuales. ¿Sí? Pero hoy, desde hace 5 años, no se puede consultar eso. Entonces, this is Mexico.
So national identity, migration, it's a national security issue at one level, right?
Sí.
Who we are is both constructed publicly, but also in secret and in exclusion because of the threat of foreigners.
Bueno, hay dos cuestiones. Hay una cuestión de secrecía, justamente yo creo en el origen de estos documentos para esconder literalmente decisiones de carácter racista frente a una política y una legislación antirracista. ¿Sí? Ahí claramente son órdenes secretas, ¿sí? Que solo pueden interpretar los cónsules que dan las visas. Esto no es público, ¿sí? Pero luego todos esos papeles, pues quedaron resguardados con alguna idea de que ahí había algo digno de ser escondido, peligroso, que mejor no se conociera, ¿sí? Así están las cosas. Hoy no podemos entrar a esos papeles. Todavía no podemos entrar a esos papeles.
Guys, I'm going to probably ask another question, but I'm also going to look to Vanessa. And I also want to inspire, I see that there are a number of you who are watching Facebook. And so those of you who are watching on Facebook, feel free to send a question along. I think I don't have that ability, but I do believe Vanessa can help us with that. But I am inspired, both Ted and Pablo, because one of the things that is interesting is, first of all, I think we need to stop talking about national identity. I think the things you're saying are much deeper, much richer. I think we need to really start using the concept of the soul of a country. And I get at that partly because, Ted, a lot of the things you're talking about, the interplay of culture and how that intersects internationally and then comes back nationally, it's all deep. And Pablo, your book as well, these are two books that really tether Mexico into a tug of war, if you will, with international flows. What can be claimed? What can be restricted? What can be incorporated? What can be changed? What can be utilized, deployed? How does it work with our internal selves? And how does it nourish us internally? What do we spit out? All of these are things that I think that your books speak to very, very energetically. What I would like to ask, and I see there is now a couple of questions, and I'll try to weave those in. What I would like to say is, I'm going to do, I guess, what historians probably shouldn't do, and that is to think about the moment now and maybe look ahead. Given what you've learned, given where we are now with the ways in which international flows are really changing conversations about, again, about a national soul, what do you see on for the future based on your work? And then from that, there is a question that has popped up that I do think we need to address from the audience. So I'll give you just a minute to reflect on that if you'd like, and if not, just let it digest. But we can get to the audience question. Pablo or Ted, or whoever, if you would like to respond.
Ted.
I mean, I think for me, and I'm going to try to tie this a little bit into the discussion we were just having about archives, but for the future, I think in terms of for historians, not necessarily for society at large here, but that what I hope my book helps us think about a little bit is how historians can be more culturally, not aware, but look to culture in the archive a little more. One of the issues that I alluded to when I started talking at the beginning was how when I went to the archives the first few times and I was looking for an African descended community to study, and I just was striking out. And I think slowly we have a newer generation of scholars who are pulling the questions of the African diaspora in the late colonial period and the early modern period and moving us forward. And I'm thinking of Sabrina Smith, Bo Gators, John Milstead, there's plenty. But as that work gets done, I think we'll be able to find what I was initially looking for back in 2005, 2006, and we're just not quite there yet. But what I think historians can do is when they're not finding something in society, is look to culture and figure out who's affiliated with that culture. And so some of my best sources that I found were actually when I would look to an artist or a musician And oftentimes they like to collect stuff about themselves. And so I found, so this person's librarian, Jerónimo Baquero Foster, he was a scrapbooker. I mean, it's a historian's dream to find a scrapbook collection in an archive. In the municipal archives in Veracruz, the popular chronicler Francisco Rivera, his library and archives are run by his granddaughter Rosario. And so I think just turning to those alternative sources gives us a way to look to the future. But I think that will also make us more relevant as we think transnationally and globally about these flows, about identity politics that are so politicized at the moment, that the ability for us as historians and academics to think about cultural history on cultural terms, I think might allow us to enter these debates and discussions in ways that we haven't yet been doing.
Thank you, Ted. Pablo, I don't know if you'd like to respond, and there is a question from the audience that's related.
Bueno, es que tus preguntas y comentarios son para otro libro, es para preparar otro libro. Mira, yo creo de que estos trabajos, el de Theodore y de alguna manera también el mío, son trabajos que digamos, desestabilizan la idea del mestizaje. ¿Sí? Esto es la pregunta es, ¿ser mestizo y defender el mestizaje es ser antirracista? Gamio pensaba que sí. Y Aguirre Beltrán también pensaba que sí. ¿Por qué pensaban que sí? Porque ellos miraban el espejo norteamericano y decían, es que en este país no hay una legislación racista. En este país a nadie por el color de su piel se le prohíbe entrar a un bar, a un negocio, a un cine o a un baño. Eso no existe en México. En México lo que existe es desigualdad social. El problema en México es la pobreza, no es el racismo, ¿sí? Pero al mismo tiempo, pensaban que los afluentes del racismo, de la raza, eran afluentes desiguales. Había un componente que era mejor que otro. Lo blanco era mejor que lo indígena. Lo blanco era más civilizado que lo indígena. Entonces, es un antirracismo racista, aunque parezca un oxímoron. Es decir, ellos no escapan de la jaula del racismo, siguen siéndolo. Ahora, no es lo mismo decir esto que yo estoy diciendo hoy, en el año 2021, que decirlo en 1936, 1937, cuando el espejo estaba en Alemania y en Europa con lo que estaba pasando. ¿Sí? Es decir, el enaltecer la mezcla sobre la pureza racial es una profunda crítica también al racismo exterminador. ¿Sí? Pero eso no los exime a estos pensadores mexicanos de continuar siendo racistas, porque siguen pensando en que los hombres están divididos, ¿sí? En colores distintos, en calidades distintas, en culturas distintas y que unas son mejores que las otras. Entonces, el problema hoy, yo creo que en México, es qué vamos a hacer con el mestizaje, ¿sí? El mestizaje y el pluralismo, ¿sí? ¿Son compatibles o no son compatibles? ¿Aquel que no es mestizo es menos mexicano? Es una pregunta.
Wow. Very, very rich. I could engage you all day on, especially I love this anti-racist racism, which really hits home, and this notion of the mirror. I'm also thinking about as the mirror changes, that changes the internal conversation and dynamics internationally in powerful ways. And what ways does that also, that look in the mirror, alter the mirror? But maybe for another time. We do have a great question from David Sartorius, who's watching on Facebook. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us today. David asks, he sees your book, Ted, as inaugurating a new research agenda, one that's already being taken up by some amazing scholars right now. In terms of what you could not cover in this book, what do you see as the most fruitful avenues for future research? And what he's thinking in terms of fruitful, he's really thinking about the ways that the type of research that we do, how can it inform contemporary political struggles? Whether that's for visibility or for rights, how does one use this book in that larger process, this larger agenda that's research and quite frankly, activists? So it's for Ted, but I think there are ways in which this applies to you as well.
Well, first of all, hi, David, and thank you for attending. I think one of the parts, or the part of the book that, or the part of this research question that I'm asking that is not in the book, in that in many ways I really didn't research, I kind of hypothesized, is really in the last part where I move from, we have these cultural ideas of what is Afro-Mexico, or what is African descended identities and spaces in Mexico. And then I started the book well before the INEGI had all of its data collection on who is of African descent. And that really happened as I was finishing up the book manuscript. And so I think there's this gap in what I've done from, I have this cultural and spatial history that I've tried to articulate, or an intellectual history that I've tried to articulate. And I say, this is the foundation, this is the context for understanding the social movements that have occurred since the 1980s and the 1990s in Mexico, and that get us to this demographic and institutional visibility today. And I would love to see a historian or an ethnographer go back and now try to see if the dots that I'm laying out actually are true. Does that work? Or is there something there that I'm imposing from my work onto the present, or that I'm looking from the present and imposing back onto my work? But I think the idea of seeing how do we take cultural and intellectual history on the one hand, and then social history and political activism on the other, and how do we really completely connect them? And at least in the case for Afro-Mexico, I don't think we've done that yet. A lot of us have made really strong educated guesses working from our ethnographic work or our historical work and tried to connect it. But I think for the politics of these communities that are trying to gain the recognition that they utterly deserve, I think that connection deserves to be made better than I certainly did. And so I really hope that's something that comes out of what I do for the moment we live in, the political futures, and also the state of activism among Afro-descended people in Mexico and in the diaspora.
Ted, thank you for responding to that. Pablo, is there a way in which your book illuminates any potential political activist struggles that are happening within Mexico now? I can see certain groups, certain people who have successfully immigrated to places, maybe Mexico City, Veracruz. I'm thinking, and again, I have to take it back to what I know, but I'm thinking about, the Congolese and some of the African and Caribbean migration that has successfully come in. If they knew what you were writing about, they'd be mighty upset. It could start something, but I don't know if there are ways in which you see your book as well as perhaps part of a larger political saga?
Mira, lo que yo he querido mostrar es, primero, que es una historia con muchísimos contrastes, con muchísimas contradicciones, sin embargo, así es esta historia. Porque, por ejemplo, y esto tiene que ver con la pregunta que tú me haces, todas estas leyes y órdenes secretas que impedían, por razones de orígenes étnicos o de orígenes nacionales, impedían que extranjeros llegaran a México. Todas estas órdenes desaparecían, ¿sí? Desaparecían si el extranjero o la extranjera era un perseguido político. Las normas mexicanas tienen siempre una excepción que dice, todo esto se prohíbe, pero si el extranjero es un perseguido político, puede ingresar al país. Esto es muy curioso, porque, por ejemplo, al mismo tiempo, se prohibía, por ejemplo, el ingreso de judíos perseguidos durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial y al mismo tiempo se autorizaba el ingreso de judíos de militancia comunista. Pero entraban no por judíos, sino por comunistas. Entonces, digamos que es un antisemitismo un poco extraño, ¿sí? En donde la judeidad se borraba porque aparecía la persecución política. Bien. Lo que nosotros estamos viendo hoy en México es algo similar. En relación a que la legislación es absolutamente dura y restrictiva, pero hay una puerta para entrar a México, y es la puerta del refugio. Es si llegas a la frontera y pides refugio, ¿sí? Hay que ver si te van a dar el refugio. Pero lo curioso es que por los volúmenes de migrantes que hoy están pidiendo refugio, es probable, yo no lo sé, que el flujo de extranjeros en México crezca, se ensanche, pero por razones de persecuciones, ya no políticas, de persecuciones étnicas, de género, religiosas, de desastres naturales, de pobreza o lo que fuera. Lo que estamos viendo es que los extranjeros hoy en México están creciendo en volúmenes interesantes, no por una migración voluntaria, sino por una migración en donde hay una persecución en su origen, ¿sí? Bueno, este es un fenómeno absolutamente nuevo. ¿Por qué? Porque en los años en que yo trabajé este libro, los perseguidos son muy pocos, a excepción de una enorme excepción que fue el caso de los republicanos españoles, en donde entraron 20,000 republicanos españoles. Pero en este momento los volúmenes son por decenas de miles de personas que están pidiendo refugio en la frontera sur de México, ¿sí? Entonces, es una historia en donde, digamos, yo creo que el libro muestra continuidades, ¿sí? Entre lo que sucedió en la primera mitad y lo que está sucediendo en la segunda mitad de los años 20, del siglo XX, ¿sí? Y en las primeras décadas del siglo XXI, sí.
Pablo, this is, again, every extreme is richly illuminating. I will say, as a colonial historian, one of the things I recognize is how the state or the government alters its posture from a more Christian standpoint. And so what you seem to articulate are these echoes of the state's activity as a benevolent entity that resonates with a deep history of Mexico from a long time ago. It's very, very interesting.
Ujú.
I will say that we actually have a few minutes left, but we are done with our questions, and so we can actually break early and take Jolly up on that tasting. I'm certainly starting to feel the lunchtime ping. But I would like to offer both Pablo and Ted an opportunity to just say a final word. And let me encourage all of our viewers today, if you haven't already been on Amazon or to figure out a way to get these books, get them now. Use them in your class. Tell your friends. These are masterpieces that you must have on your shelf. And they are going to really, really help your scholarship and your understanding of Mexico profoundly. But let me give final word. Since Ted started, I think maybe we'll give him the last word. And Pablo, if there's something you'd like to say in closing today, please do so. And then we'll give it to Ted, and we will call it a 2021 Klein panel wrap. That would be it for today. So Pablo and then Ted. And Pablo, if there's anything you'd like to say to end, just any final words today.
Para cerrar, es que no te escucho bien, se ha cortado tus palabras.
Sorry about that. I was just inviting both of you to close today.
Okay, okay, thank you. Okay.
Before someone snuck in a question, and that's Ed Davis. How you doing? It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. If you would like, in your closing remarks as well, if there's anything either of you would also like to say to the fact that the 2020 Mexican census finds no disadvantage for Afro-descendants. If any of you would like to reflect on that too, as you just say a few closing words today. And I want to thank our audience for joining us.
Sí, yo tengo la palabra para cerrar. Sí. Bueno, dos cosas que me gustaría aclarar. El problema el caso, más que el problema de la migración afro a México, ¿sí? Como el de la migración china o judía, etcétera, fue en el caso afro particularmente muy complicado porque se cruza nacionalidad con el color de la piel. Y para las propias autoridades mexicanas esto fue muy complicado. Pero lo interesante, o lo único interesante en esto, es de que había una excusa con el cual se justificaba esta prohibición. Y la excusa era de que era una excusa pública. Eso está escrito en documentos hacia las asociaciones, por ejemplo, afro en Estados Unidos. Es de que los trabajadores de origen afro en México son trabajadores que estaban dispuestos a trabajar en condiciones de trabajo y salariales inferiores a las condiciones mexicanas. De tal manera de que era una competencia desleal a ese trabajador. Pero esto no es cierto. Lo que está detrás de esto, lo que está detrás en los documentos internos de la agencia migratoria, es de que hay un problema de raza inferior. hay un problema de una mezcla que pone en peligro la ya débil mezcla mexicana, ¿sí? Y que la presencia de sangre afro en el mestizaje mexicano degrada todavía más. Esto es tremendo, esto es tremendo, ¿sí? Es decir, esto es lo que encontramos nosotros en los documentos y en las explicaciones de los antropólogos. ¿Sí? Bien, ahora para ir cerrando, y con esto ya concluyo. Bueno, yo creo de que se abren perspectivas de trabajo muy interesantes, sobre todo vis a vis con lo que se está haciendo del otro lado de la frontera, en Estados Unidos. Creo que la posibilidad de establecer comunicación, ¿sí?, entre políticas, ver la manera en que las políticas migratorias de ambos países, contrariamente a lo que se puede pensar, estaban en algunos casos más de acuerdo de lo que se piensa. Es decir, actuaban en muchos casos de manera coordinada, ¿sí?, en las políticas de exclusión. Y también la manera en que lo irregular, lo ilegal, el mundo de los negocios, de la corrupción, trabaja a ambos lados de la frontera también. Nosotros hemos encontrado documentación que muestra redes de autoridades del otro lado y de autoridades de este lado en los negocios del tráfico de migrantes. Yo creo que ojalá puedan volver a abrirse estos papeles, y en esta dirección creo que se va a ampliar muchísimo la posibilidad de entender mucho mejor la frontera sur de Estados Unidos y norte de México, y encontrar vasos de comunicación mucho más estrechos de lo que se piensa. ¿Sí? Muchas
Pablo,
gracias.
thank you for those final words. And Ted, anything on your end at all?
I think what I'd like to end with is saying that the field of study on Mexico's African heritage, its relationship to the diaspora, has changed so dramatically in the past 20, 25 years. And I think we're in a moment right now in the last few where it's at this inflection point where the amount of new scholarship and new ideas coming to it are just happening faster than we can believe. I mean, I can remember, I guess it must have been about 5 years ago, Ben, we were at a conference table at a luncheon talking about the 2015 Intercentral Survey with some other historians. And this was this cutting edge new thing. And, you know, and suddenly I had something new that I needed to talk about somewhere in my book. At that point, I was still working on writing it. And then by the time my book went off to be published, we had the 2020 census. That is, again, changing the dimensions. I mean, the number of people identifying as Afro-Mexican, Afro-descendant, or Black went from 1.4 million to 2.5 in 5 years. And it's not because suddenly there were more people who miraculously were born or migrated to Mexico to do this. It's that the politics in Mexico changed around this issue. And I think what we just have to keep in mind as scholars, as academics, but also just as people living today, that this is just changing. And it's built, you know, some of the conclusions that I'm making now are going to look very odd in a couple of years from now, because the way we're talking about this project and these politics are going to be different. But that, you know, my book was not possible without that 2015 survey. It wasn't possible without the work by people like you, Ben, and many others who pioneered this field for the colonial era and into the 19th century and the last few decades. And I mean, I can only imagine what's going to be coming forward now as we have people like who asked the person who asked that question, who are now going to interrogate why would Mexico say this about the 2020 census, when that's so clearly a myopic conclusion that needs to be interrogated both historically, culturally, ethnographically, sociologically, and now we just have something else to hold on to as we keep moving forward in this field that has the potential to do so much, especially since there are so many people who study Mexico and that who do Mexican history. And so hopefully this 2020 census will just be another springboard for another generation to come.
Ed, thank you, Pablo. This has been terrific panel. I want to thank our guest commentators today, Jocelyn Alcott and Kith Augustine, and thank all of you in the audience for taking your time on a Saturday to join us for this presentation of awards. And this has been a delight for me to serve on this committee. I'm going to take with me one of the words that Pablo said that also fits with what Ted said. You know, where does mestizaje fit now? Where does it fit now? I'm going to be taking that with me. Everyone, have a great afternoon. LASA, thank you for hosting, and we will see you soon. Take care, guys.